The walls of the family visit unit are painted pale cream, intended to soothe. There's a small kitchenette with a miniature fridge. Plush armchairs flank a microwave oven. It's late November, deep winter. The cold has nothing to do with the warmth inside. For a few fleeting hours, this hidden room allows loved ones to feel human again. But midnight has brought stillness. The only sound is the soft hum of fluorescent tubes overhead. A gas cuts it. A phone lies on the low coffee table. Nearby, a man sits, David Brinson, 55. His face is lined. The locks carrying stories, each crease etched with the weight of 4 life sentences. His voice is measured as he speaks. She passed out. The guard, uniform dress, half woken, grips the phone. Another guard rushes in. Outside this pale sanctuary, flashing lights cast bars of red and blue onto the concrete walls. Sirens bellow in the distance. Pain approaching. Inglewood, California. The woman on the floor is Stephanie Dowells, 62. Her skin is porcelain. Her breathing, faint, fading. She'd come here to find a sliver of peace. A small business owner, hairdresser, the glue of her family. A grandmother. A faithful soul who spent evenings pushing David toward redemption. Bible study in hushed tones. Prayers for him to be better than the worst he once was. Her grandson. He'd seen her hours before. They baked cookies in her warm kitchen. He kissed her cheek. The scent of vanilla and youth has now turned into bleach and blood. A scrap of bristle brush lies near. The world is silent, except for an officer scrambling footsteps down the corridor. Some hours earlier, evening had fallen. The prison hushed. Family visit regulations are strict. These overnight visits are rare, granted only to inmates deemed low risk. If behavior meets expectations. Privacy in exchange for humanity. They moved inside, clasped hands by the kitchenette. Brief ritual. Words spoken fragment by fragment. Thank you. I love you. I'm trying. She had been the balm to his rage, the tether to conscience. He had been patient. Reading from the worn Bible she brought. Later, she collapsed. Or maybe something darker. Paramedics work frantically. His name is called next, David Brinson, for murdered men 20 years ago. The quadruple homicide was execution style, a bleak score, justice delivered in a crowded courtroom. Now his wife lies on a gurney. The coroner arrives at dawn. Home to this prison rectangular world is a cold, steel truck with flashing lights. Lab-coated figure steps inside, inspecting Stephanie's neck, the bruises on her collarbone, fingerprint outlines, horror in the soft fog of early morning. Homicide by strangulation. Official words that crack silence like a gunshot. She did not just pass out. The words echo through the complex, through barbed wire, darkened corridors. Families in the visiting rooms wait and don't know why they'll never get their loved one back. David stands through the sterile glare of fluorescent lights in a holding room. He's shorn and shaved. His tattoos, maps of violence, peek from his collar. He says nothing. His lips don't move. The staff whispered, "What really happened in there?" But only cold steel walls have answers, and they've swallowed them all. A warden comes forward. We need a statement. Outside, the sun rises over Ione, California, lighting the prison walls with sickly gold. Somewhere a mother wakes, noticing her daughter is 2 hours late. A door clicks. The camera lingers on the blank wall, because out here every second counts. But the seconds right now are lost. By the time word reached Stephanie's family, the official language had already been softened. A medical incident during a family visit. Transported to a local hospital. Condition unknown. The kind of bureaucratic phrasing designed to cushion the blow while buying the institution time to arrange its narrative. Her daughter, Monique, didn't wait for the next call. She got in her car and drove. The radio turned off, the road a blur. Mule Creek State Prison is an hour from her home, but that night it felt like it stretched across a continent. She knew her mother had gone to see David. Again, she also knew David's history. But knowing something in theory and standing in the snow outside a prison gate while an officer tells you your mother is gone are two entirely different realities. The official story, as told to the family, was that David had called for help, that Stephanie had simply collapsed in the visiting unit's living room, that paramedics had done everything they could. The reality, according to the coroner's report, was much colder. The bruising patterns were distinct, ring-shaped, high on the neck, classic compression marks from human hands. There were petechiae in the eyes. This was strangulation, and not the quick kind. It was the kind where seconds drag into minutes. The kind where, if anyone had been nearby, they might have heard her fighting for air. The days before the visit were a strange mix of the mundane and the extraordinary. Stephanie had been in good spirits, telling a friend she was going to see her man for a couple of days. She packed snacks she knew he liked, cornbread muffins, peanut brittle. She brought a new devotional book, something they could read together during their time. For David, this was his chance to step briefly out of the cement and steel world he'd known since the mid-90s. Family visits weren't just about intimacy. They were about privacy. No cameras inside, no constant guard presence, only periodic checks. It was a fragile trust between the inmate, the institution, and the visitor. But trust in this case was a perfect cover. David Brinson wasn't just any inmate. In 1993, he'd been convicted in a quadruple homicide for lives taken in a gang-related shooting, each victim executed at close range. The trial was high profile at the time, headlines in black ink, courtroom sketches on the evening news. He received 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. And yet, in 2024, he still qualified for conjugal visits under California's family visiting program. Critics had warned for years that violent offenders shouldn't be given that privilege. Mule Creek's administration insisted that behavior inside the prison counted more than past crimes. On paper, David had been clean for years. Stephanie seemed to believe that meant something. It wasn't the first time she'd visited him. Friends describe her as devoted, maybe to a fault. She saw the man behind the crimes, the man who wrote her letters filled with scripture and longing. He promised her he was a changed man. She wanted to believe him, not just for her sake, but for her family's. She wanted to prove people wrong. But in the visiting unit that night, something shifted. Neighbors in nearby units later told investigators they'd heard muffled arguing, not shouting, below. Urgent exchange, words indistinct through the thin walls. One of them remembered hearing a chair scrape sharply against the tile. Then silence. When the coroner's ruling came back, homicide, it sent a chill through the prison community. Guards who'd worked the unit replayed their last interactions with David in their minds. One recalled how calm he seemed when they arrived, sitting in the armchair, hands folded in his lap. Another said his voice on the emergency call had been oddly flat, without panic. The prison administration's official line was swift. The death was under investigation. They didn't comment on policy, didn't confirm whether any reforms would follow. Behind closed doors, though, the question everyone was asking was the same. How could this happen under our watch? For Stephanie's family, the shock was quickly giving way to anger. They wanted answers. They wanted to know how a man convicted of 4 murders could be left alone with their mother, with no one watching, no safeguard to prevent exactly this. They wanted to know why it took so long to tell them she was gone. The truth, when it started to surface, was uglier than they could have imagined, because Stephanie's death wasn't the first of its kind at Mule Creek in recent months. And the last person anyone expected to connect the dots was about to do exactly that. It began with a phone call to Stephanie's oldest daughter, Latasha, from a woman she didn't know. The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. She introduced herself as the sister of Tania Thomas, another woman who had visited her incarcerated husband at Mule Creek earlier in the year. Tania never made a home either. In March 2024, Tania had gone in for her own family visit. Her husband had been serving a sentence for a non-homicide offense, but when she was found dead in the unit's bathroom, the cause was labeled undetermined. The prison said little, and her death never made headlines. No charges were filed. But now, in the shadow of Stephanie's death, Tania's family was re-examining every detail. The bruising on her arms, the mark on her temple, the unanswered questions that had been quietly shelved. When Latasha hung up the phone, her heart was racing. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about a pattern. News outlets began to pick up whispers of the connection. Local reporters staked out Mule Creek, pressing guards for comments as they left their shifts. The Sacramento Bee ran the first headline. 2 women dead in family visits at same California prison. Are policies to blame? Suddenly, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, was in the hot seat. Their family visiting program had long been defended as a rehabilitation tool, but now, every aspect of it was under scrutiny. How were inmates screened for eligibility? Were violent histories truly weighed? Were there any safeguards to protect visitors in the absence of guards? The prison's official statement was clinical. Both incidents were isolated tragedies and currently under investigation. But leaked internal memos told another story. Staff had quietly raised concerns months before Stephanie's death, warning that the privacy of these units could make them dangerous for certain high-risk inmates. Those warnings, it seemed, had been ignored. For Stephanie's family, the outrage boiled over into action. They began organizing with Tania's relatives, holding vigils outside the prison gates. Candles flickered in the cold night air. Signs read, "Protect visitors and no more secrets." Passing drivers honked in support. Some rolled down their windows to yell words of encouragement. Inside Mule Creek, the atmosphere was shifting. Inmates who once saw family visits as untouchable privileges now felt the weight of the lockdowns that followed each death. Tensions rose in the yard. Guards whispered about policy changes coming down from Sacramento. And in the visiting units, the once rare sounds of laughter and private conversation were replaced by the nervous awareness of eyes, and maybe cameras where there had been none. The media pressure reached a peak when NBC News aired an investigative segment, showing side-by-side photos of Stephanie and Tania, their smiles frozen in happier times. Over the images, the anchor's voice asked, "How many more families will it take before the system admits it has a problem?" The district attorney's office could no longer delay. After reviewing the coroner's findings, the witness statements, and the prison's own logs from that night, they made the announcement Stephanie's family had been waiting for. David Brinson would be charged with murder. The words felt both like a victory and a wound reopening. Justice, at last, seemed possible, but nothing would bring her back. And the system that allowed it to happen was still intact. The camera cuts to the courthouse steps on the day of the arraignment announcement. Reporters swarm the DA as he steps up to the microphones. Behind him, protesters hold both Stephanie's and Tania's photos side by side. The DA clears his throat. No one inside or outside prison walls is above the law, and no one visiting a loved one should have to fear for their life. The words ripple through the crowd. But whether those words would lead to real change or fade as just another soundbite remained to be seen. The day of David Brinson's arraignment arrived under a pale, brittle sky. The courthouse in Amador County seemed to draw the cold in, the stone steps rimmed with frost. Television crews huddled in clusters, their breath fogging in the morning air as camera operators adjusted focus on the wooden double doors. When Brinson finally appeared, flanked by 2 correctional officers, the crowd surged forward. He wore the standard orange jumpsuit, but his posture was unervingly casual. No shackles on his hands, only his ankles, leaving his fingers free to clasp a thick manila folder labeled defense. The evidence stamped from months earlier, when the folder sat in the DA's hands, was gone. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut, almost airless. Stephanie's family filled the front rows on the left, dressed in black. Her daughter Latasha clutched a photo of her mother, smiling radiant in both hands. Across the aisle, 2 of Brinson's siblings sat in silence, their expressions unreadable. When the clerk read out the charge, murder, with special circumstances, the words landed with the same weight they had carried on the courthouse steps outside. Brinson's eyes flickered toward the gallery, briefly locking with Latasha's. It wasn't anger in her gaze. It was something colder. The prosecution laid out their case in a concise but devastating opening statement. They described the evidence in clinical detail. The coroner's findings, the bruising patterns, the timing of the emergency call, the inconsistencies in Brinson's story. They highlighted that Stephanie had been dead for several minutes before anyone was summoned, and that Brinson, a man who knew the mechanics of violence, would have recognized the signs of fatal injury. When it was the defense's turn, their strategy was clear: plant seeds of doubt. They suggested that Stephanie had suffered a sudden medical event, that her bruises could be explained by CPR attempts or a fall. They hinted at flaws in the coroner's methodology, subtle but calculated attacks meant to erode the prosecution's certainty. But outside the sterile back and forth of legal arguments, the human cost was on full display. At the mid-morning recess, Stephanie's youngest granddaughter, just 12 years old, broke down in the hallway. Her sobs echoed against the marble walls as her aunt wrapped her in a coat. A reporter nearby lowered his camera, suddenly aware that some moments weren't meant to be broadcast. Back inside, the DA brought forward a surprise. Testimony from a former Mule Creek Corrections officer who had been on duty during another family visit death. Tania Thomas's case. The defense objected immediately, arguing it was irrelevant, prejudicial. The judge allowed limited testimony, enough for the jury to hear that 2 women had died under eerily similar circumstances in less than a year, both within the same isolated units, both with men they trusted. The impact was palpable. Even the court reporters typing seemed to slow. As court adjourned for the day, the crowd spilled back into the frigid air. Protesters on both sides raised their voices. One sign read, "Protect visitors," and "Family visits for lifers." Another counter with "Family is a right, not a privilege." The clash of voices followed Stephanie's family all the way to the parking lot. Latasha paused at her car door, looking back at the courthouse. "I just want them to say her name," she whispered to no one in particular. To remember she was more than a case file. But Brinson's arraignment was only the beginning. The legal machinery would grind on for months, maybe years. In the meantime, the CDCR's public defense of its policies was hardening. A spokesperson appeared on the evening news, praising the integrity of the family visiting program and cautioning against rash decisions based on isolated incidents. For Stephanie's family, those words cut deeper than silence. And in the echo of those statements, a deeper question was forming. One that would not only define the case, but force California to confront the cracks in its prison walls. The weeks after Brinson's arraignment were a blur of legal motions, public statements, and quiet grief. Stephanie's family returned to Inglewood, but the courthouse was never far from their minds. Every phone call from the DA's office set their hearts pounding. Every envelope stamped by Amador County Superior Court felt like a fresh wound. For Latasha, the fight had shifted. She no longer saw the trial as just about her mother's death. It was about stopping another family from standing where hers stood. She began speaking at town halls, prison oversight meetings, anywhere she could find an audience. Her voice, at first shaking, grew steadier with each telling of the story. How a woman walked into a prison to see her husband and never walked out again. The CDCR's public relations machine doubled down. They released a statement reaffirming their belief in family visits as a rehabilitative tool, pointing to decades of data showing positive outcomes for inmates who maintain strong family ties. They stressed that Brinson's case was an aberration, an outlier. The language carefully chosen suggests no systemic change was necessary. But for many Californians, that argument rang hollow. If the policy could not account for the danger posed by a man with 4 life sentences for a quadruple homicide, what exactly was protecting? Stephanie's death became the focal point of a broader movement. Advocacy groups pushed for Stephanie's Law, a proposal to bar inmates serving life without parole for violent crimes from participating in family visits. The bill stalled in committee, but not before drawing national headlines and dividing public opinion. On one side, families of inmates arguing that punishing all for the actions of few is unjust. On the other, victims' rights groups pointing to Stephanie's and Tania's deaths as evidence that trust could not be safely extended to the most dangerous prisoners. In Amador County, Brinson's defense team filed motions to suppress certain pieces of evidence. The court calendar stretched further and further out. The case wouldn't see a full trial for many months, maybe years. Stephanie's family braced for the long haul. In the meantime, they held vigils on the anniversary of her death, her photo framed by candles and flowers outside Mule Creek's gates. The air always smelled of wax and cold earth. Passers-by would sometimes stop, bow their heads, and move on in silence. One night, as the candles burned low and the protest signs leaned tired against the fence, Latasha looked up at the looming prison walls. Snowflakes drifted down, catching in the floodlights. "They're still in there," she said quietly, almost to herself. "The people who know what happened. The ones who heard or saw and said nothing. Her cousin shifted beside her. You think someone protecting him? Latasha didn't answer. She just kept staring at the darkened windows, the glint of wire above them, because that was the part that gnawed at her most. Not just that her mother was gone, but that somewhere behind those walls, someone else held the truth. And until it came out, there could be no real justice. She had come here to love him. She left here in the coroner's van. And the one person who could tell the world exactly why is still sitting in a cell, waiting for his day in court.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more Echoed Crime content. Thank you.